Hey, what is going on, everybody? Luca here from the Movie Pope podcast. So today I'm going to be presenting a very interesting episode that I did with Claire Lynch from England. We had a close to 2 hour long discussion about Shakespeare and Tudor politics. Now, as it's a very dense and very in depth conversation, I decided to break it up into several episodes. So probably over the next 3 weeks, you'll get snippets of our conversation, and then I'll air the entire conversation in full, probably a month or so afterwards. But go ahead, sit back, relax, enjoy, and listen to the conversation, and let us know down in the comments below what you think. As always, thanks for watching, and let's dive in. One and all, welcome back to the Movie Pope podcast. And today we are doing another Shakespeare episode. Yes, I know you couldn't get enough of Colin David Reese when we had a 5-part special about Shakespeare, and we're going to be doing more with our discussion of Shakespeare and his world and the Elizabethan England of the 16th century. But before we dive in, remember to like, comment, subscribe, and please share these videos with everybody that you know, because we are looking to grow our audience, and the more who know about this, the better. And really, we are looking to expand our episode topics to include many things, not just movie or arts related, but topics about politics and history and all that good stuff. Because you know what, I can have a life outside, outside of chatting about movies with the Movie Pope. He doesn't own me, but don't tell him that. So today I've got Claire Lynch. Is it Claire, right?
It is, yes. Hello.
Claire. So I've got Claire here today, and we are going to chat about Tudor politics and how they influenced the one and only William Shakespeare. Claire, how are you doing
Hello.
on this fine? Well, here it's afternoon, but over there it's evening where you are. How are you
Yeah,
doing
it's
today?
I'm very well actually. It's been a nice, bit waterlogged at the moment. We've been unprecedented rain over where I am, so
Holy
yeah,
crap. It's funny you should say that because for the past 2 days here, it's been raining like cats and dogs. So,
it's been awful. It's been really bad. Just can't seem to get a break. So it's very bleak.
but to be
I feel I
fair,
feel I feel like I'm in the start of a Charles Dickens novel. It's just rain.
but to be fair, you
What?
are but to be fair, you are living in merry old England, and as we
That's
all
true.
know, Old Blighty is renowned for being a rainy rock in the middle of the North Sea, to quote Jeremy
That's
Clarkson.
very true. Very true.
I was waiting to pull that quote out, by the way.
Good for you. Good slotting in there.
So, so before we get started, Claire, why don't you go ahead and tell us a little bit about yourself, who you are, and what your interest is in Shakespeare?
My name's Claire. I've been working. I work as an educator. I've been educating since 2006. Before then, I fell in love with Shakespeare. The first time I was always aware of him. My dad was really into Shakespeare. The first time I properly fell in love with him was when I saw. I know it's very problematic and people have got their own opinions, but when I first saw the Kenneth Branagh version of Much Ado About Nothing.
Oh, I thought you can say Shakespeare in Love.
No, I enjoyed that one, but it was when I saw the Branagh version of Much Ado, and now I've explored it a bit more, and I know that some people love it and hate it, but to me it was something spectacular about it, and what I really liked was, and I still perpetuate to this day, that people have always said Shakespeare is for the intelligent people, and it's almost like you get to those theme parks and they've got a sign that says you must be this high to ride.
Hmm.
And it's almost like that you must be this intellectual to understand and appreciate Shakespeare, and that's always stuck with me. And I'm thinking, no, you don't. What are you talking about? And it's been my mission to kind of smash that myth and push that Shakespeare is for the masses. And I remember seeing this film in the cinema, going, I understood that, but I thought that Shakespeare was not supposed to be understood by people like me, poor-brained me, and I understood it. And as I got more into it, I started coming to the conclusion that, yeah, I've been sold a lie here somewhere, or there's been a misnomer or a Mandela effect somewhere that I thought Shakespeare was only for the intellectuals. And yes, it is clever. And yes, there are um, librarians with big beards and dusty books who've theorized and hypothesized and parenthesized and studied Shakespeare. And there is elements of intellectuality in his writing, absolutely. But at the deep heart of it, Shakespeare was an everyman for everyman. And I think some people need to realize or remember that fact that it wasn't for very plummy actors being very serious on stage. It was for absolutely everybody. And Shakespeare was a Brummie. He was from Birmingham. He had a very thick uh, kind of Midland accent, which I think is wonderful. But there are people in the world who don't think it is classy, shall we say.
Yeah, and I was gonna say too, because when I did my interview with Colin a few months back, and I'll have a link for it down below. We we were chatting about the academic and the actor's approach to Shakespeare, because
Mm,
because like you said, the actor is going to have one way of viewing Shakespeare, because
mm,
they're approaching it from a performance standpoint, right? So
mm,
the way they understand and interpret you know the plays is going to be quite different from from an academic who is going to approach it from a much different paradigm. Um, and
absolutely.
and what I find so fascinating is the fact that these two views don't necessarily need to be at odds with each other, but but that's what you see. I mean, would you agree with
I
that
do, I
statement?
do, I do, and I think, um, I mean, I am going to declare my bias here because I fall down squarely on the actor's side of it, and my
Oh, I thought you were
reasoning
going to say the
is
academic side.
no, no, not at all. I mean that I approach it thus: is when Shakespeare started, what did Shakespeare start as? He started as an actor.
Right.
And I've always said, I've always maintained that Shakespeare is for the stage, not the page. And for example, I'm reading I'm in the south of England, and I'm aware of productions that go on around me, and I know that there's a production company on the Isle of Wight near me that do a lot of Shakespeare, and they've constantly said that, you know, if you think you understand Shakespeare or think you don't, come and see it. Come and see it. It's for the stage. You don't get it just by reading it. And I think there's been a mistake in the English curriculum, school curriculum, where they're made to study it as English literature,
Hmm.
not drama. Because Shakespeare would get a real kick knowing that people were reading it, and he'd be like, huh, "That's really funny. Why are they reading it? They should be performing it." And
It's
and
it's kind of it's kind of like sorry to interrupt, but it's kind of like if to use a modern reference, it's kind of like how John Lennon felt when he found out that academics were trying to take apart Beatles lyrics, and then he wrote "I Am the
oh
Walrus"
yeah,
as a response to that, because at the
that
end of the day,
yeah,
it's like, why are you putting too much thought into this? It's not
exactly.
meant to
I
be
mean,
this.
Paul McCartney was on recently, exactly the same. And the first line of the big first Beatles song I saw her standing there was, "She was just 17, you know what I mean." And the
Hmm.
amount of essays and interviews and people going to goes, "I think it's coming from this kind of this Brechtian kind of thinking of, oh, but and he's like, no, no, mean rhymes with 17. That's it. And yes, that you can get intellectual into Shakespeare, and you should, because sometimes there is more to it. I mean, if you look at, some of the great big soliloquies from Hamlet, the musings of the to be or not to be, you know, there must have been a way that Shakespeare wrote it that he had in mind, with the stress and intonation that he thought, you know what, this is how I envisage Hamlet being in this scene. He's got all this stuff going on, and this is what I want him to do. And he wrote it. He wrote down to be or not to be. That is the question, whether it is noble in the mind. He wrote it all down with a
Right.
certain delivery in his mind. Didn't record it. There's no stage directions. There's no. The only clues we get are from the rest of the text before and the rest of the text after. And yet, if you look at all the ways that that has been performed, and each way that an actor performs it makes sense.
So I want to ask you this, because this is something that I've been thinking about ever since September with the last interview. Now, Colin asserts that that when we read a text like the to be or not to be, it sounds like it seems like we would put the stress on that is the question, as if it's a moral question of whether one should live or die, right? The
Mm,
question of suicide. But he asserts that you know that Shakespeare's intent was to be or not to be. That is the question.
mm,
It becomes a bit more reflective, like you know you know what is the true quandary of the play. It's not
mm,
or not the play, but the moral dilemma. It's not whether or not he ought to commit suicide, but whether or not he should go through with the act of killing Claudius.
mm. Oh,
So yeah,
it's
yeah,
fascinating, isn't it?
and it's such a and yeah, exactly, and it actually changes it, because if you actually say it out loud, like to be or not to be, that is the question. Like all of a sudden, it changes the trajectory of where you think is the play is going to go, as opposed to saying to be or not to be. That is the question. You know.
Yeah. And if you perform it with no stresses, again, it works even better. To be or not to be, that is the question. And
I mean,
that also to be or not to be.
yeah,
That
exactly.
statement again. And again, I've seen versions of it. I've seen versions where the stress is on a different word. I've seen so many, and every single one makes sense. But again, you have to look at then the context of the wider play. What has happened before? How have the director and the actors set up the relationship between Claudius, Gertrude, and Hamlet, and Horatio and Hamlet, and all these amazing things that happen afterwards?
Right.
And
Because people
that,
because you do lose sight of of that, because there's so many things happening, but a lot of people will forget that the overall you know issue that Hamlet has to deal with is avenging his father, which means killing
mm,
Claudius. But
yes,
but I mean but I mean to your point, I mean people get so mired in these soliloquies
yes.
that they kind of forget, that they kind of think, oh, it's these are worlds within themselves, but they kind of forget, no, Hamlet is speaking not not to an internalized feeling, but or should I say to his own little microcosm, but he is addressing an issue in the wider world, which is,
Yes.
I was presented with this issue by this ghost who may or may not be my dead father, and who has
Mm,
told me I was murdered by your uncle, who is now married to your mother. You've got to avenge me, right? So,
yeah.
because originally when I read it, I kind of lost sight of what was going on. So then, by the time you get to the end of the play, you're like, wait, like that's what he's doing now. Like, what the hell happened here? And
Yeah,
you're like,
I know. And then you're missing the other one as well. There's a subplot within the subplot within the subplot, and
right,
that's the plot of Fortinbras. Now, Fortinbras comes in as a kind of seems a minor character, but Fortinbras and Hamlet are kind of mirrors because they both lost their fathers at the same time, and they're both seeking vengeance, but Hamlet is seeking vengeance on his father's killer, that fratricide, and
right,
Fortinbras is seeking vengeance because his dad was killed by Hamlet Senior.
right.
So they're
Well,
kind of the same age. They're on the same kind of path of vengeance, but one succeeds and one doesn't.
right, and that's and well, I guess to complicate matters, you've also got the issue with Laertes, who is
Yep.
who's also on his own vendetta mission, because he believes
Yes.
that Hamlet's responsible for killing Ophelia, who
And his dad.
well, I mean, to be fair, Polonius did have it coming. I mean, I
To be
didn't see
honest,
anything
yeah.
wrong
If
with
you
that.
if you're going to stand behind an arras and earwig, you're gonna, you're asking for trouble, really.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there's a funny scene from The Simpsons where they were doing their own version of it, and
Yes.
Bart he's playing Hamlet. He stabs, he stabs Polonius, and he's like, Polonius, what are you doing there? He's like, I hide behind curtains because I'm scared of getting stabbed. And I'm like,
Oh, brilliant.
and I'm like, that is the best way to sum up Polonius right there.
I mean, and that this you kind of say, oh, Hamlet's a tragedy, and I I sometimes think that the characters don't know they're in a tragedy, and so when Horatio and Marcellus are on the the tower at the beginning, they
Yeah.
don't know it's a tragedy. To them, it's another day. At the end, they do it's a tragedy. And I think a lot of productions I've seen which start in a tragedy mindset, it's very hard to watch. You know, the first line, who's there, in a very tragic way, it's like, oh dear, we're in for 4 hours of really intense tragedy. And I do sometimes think that people forget it's entertainment. There are very funny lines in Hamlet. There are some very funny bits in it. And it's not all tragedy. It is a tragedy. It's the tragedy of Hamlet,
Hmm.
but there are really funny bits in there, and not just the comic interludes. It's very funny, but there is that tragedy in it. And I think if you approach it as a tragedy, all a tragedy, then it kind of comes away from what I think Shakespeare was trying to do. If you think about, and it comes back to the point that I was saying about Shakespeare being for the everyman,
Hmm.
a lot of the time the Shakespeare's Globe was for the and all theatre at that time. It was the mass media. You didn't have radio. The illiteracy rate was very high, and theatre was cheap and common. You'd go to the cinema, sorry, the theatre just as much as you would flick on TikTok or go turn on the TV. You'd go, oh, what am I going to do now? I'll go to the theatre, and you'd get 6,000 braying groundlings. They're ill-educated, they're smelly, they're probably drunk, they're baying for blood. They're not going to stand around for a tight 4.5 hours of tragedy. They want to be entertained. They want a little bit of love, a bit of cheeky satire. They want a rude word or two. They want a plot. They want a sword fight. They want everything. And that's what I think the plays are all about. They're all about entertainment. And this comes back to the theme that you've asked me to kind of to cover, and that's the theme of politics. And
Yeah.
what I think the plays were, they were a really good early example of mass media because you had 6,000 people regularly, 2 or 3 plays a day, 6 days a week, all the way through the year. You can get political opinion through there. You can get kind of satire in there. And there are examples, surviving examples of satire in the plays. And often it gets overlooked and people try and explain it. And the best example I can think of is in the play Much Ado About Nothing, when
Hmm.
Beatrice is talking about the bear ward. I'd take sixpence for the bear ward, and it doesn't kind of make sense if you read it with modern eyes. And I often talk about if you watch current affairs programs now, or current, we've got a program called Have I Got News for You, and Mock the
I
Week.
watched that. Yes,
Yeah,
Ian Hislop and Paul Merton. Yep.
that's it. So it's like when you watch a rerun of those programs 6 months down the line, and you go, "I'm sorry, what on earth are you talking about?" It makes no sense later on. And when Beatrice is talking about the Bear Ward, what Shakespeare was doing at the time, they were having an argument with their neighbours at the Globe, which was the Bear Pit, and the guy who owned the Bear Pit was giving them grief and hassle. So he wrote it into the play, basically
It's
having a
like a
go,
dig. Yeah.
a dig. And of
Yeah.
course, if you're there at the time, and someone goes, "Hey, up that bear ward," everyone's going to roll about laughing, going, "That is the greatest bit of satire I've ever heard. That's wonderful," and it stays. And now, what 400, 500 years, people have been going, "Oh yes, the bear ward." And yes, well, Shakespeare's obviously making a comment about the bear. Could the bear be the Russian bear? Could it be this bear? No, it was the annoying neighbor next door. And sometimes those satire get in there. And I think um, the politics at the time were well, I was going to say they're different, but they're kind of not. You can see similarities and differences between modern politics and modern goings on. Um,
Hmm.
but I think it's contextual, and I think people, when looking at Shakespeare, need to remember the context, both historical, political, to kind of understand Shakespeare better. To go back to Much Ado About Nothing, you start, you don't get any background, you just get Dom Pedro and his merry men turning up after a war. And then all the fun and games proceed from there. There's no explanation as to what the war was, why they were in, Padua? Why are they in Italy if they're Spanish? And then you got to think, well, hang on, these people who are clowns essentially in this play, people like Benedict, who is a proper clownish figure. He's not a clown, he's a fighter, he's a soldier. And if you think about 15th century, 16th century warfare, it was brutal. It was man to man, eye to eye. If you didn't kill the person in front of you, they would kill you. And if you didn't trust the man on your right, you would be dead. And these people, they are killers, they're hardened men. They're kind of almost psychopathic in a way that they're kind of they kill.
It's
And
kind of like
yet,
the how we make fun of the Vietnam War vets because of the
yes,
things that they've seen and done, and I mean, every movie, every show that you see, you have that one-legged Vietnam vet. He's like, "I've seen things, man. I've seen
yes,
things."
that's it. Even over in England, you get the kind of phrase, "You don't know, man. You weren't there."
Yeah,
And
exactly,
and
exactly.
yet and yet people go, "Oh yes, Benedict, what a lovable character," and you go, "Well, he's quite clearly not."
But they're missing the point because
Yes.
and I can speak from experience because my because my parents, they came from Southeast Asia in the
Mm,
70s, and if you're familiar with what happened over there, it was a huge shit show for the
mm,
next 20 years. And my dad
absolutely.
and my dad was a soldier, and my mother, she lived through the killing fields in Cambodia. And what struck me was the fact that everybody had a black sense of humor. And
Yes.
I remember my mother telling me, she telling me how one day in the camps, because it how my maternal grandparents, by the way, they they had to deal with the camp commandant, and he was this young lad, probably like late mid to late 20s, and when you're that young and you've been invested with all that power, you kind of feel like you're on top of the world. And and surprisingly, he was acting very courteous towards them because because when you're part of that regime, there's only one thing that you do, and you basically just torture and kill people. But
Mm.
he was behaving very reasonably well. And and my mother was like, my grandmother turned to my grandfather and said, that commandant is such a nice boy. It's such a shame he kills people, though. And I'm like, and I'm like that,
Whoa.
I'm like, that is, I mean, that is just the beans. That is how you survive trauma, is to have that
Yes.
kind of sense of humor. So I do want to I do want to go back a little bit because
Yeah.
this is my wheelhouse here. Renaissance to early modern warfare. I read the stuff, and I've even bought the costume. So every November when I go to a Renaissance festival, I dress like a 17th century pikeman. I mean, you
Oh,
want to keep
nice. What faction are you? A Roundhead or a Cavalier? New Middle
um
Army?
think more of Holy Roman Empire. So
Oh,
so I've got the Morian helmet with the red feathers, and I've got the breastplate, and the back plate, and then I've got the what do you call it? It's like the buff coat, and then
oh
the boots and
yes,
everything.
nice.
I don't have a pike though, but I have a spear. Um, but that's a topic for a different time. But but going back to your point about Benedict being a soldier, we have to keep in mind that that for England, they've been at war since 1337 up until 1453 in the Hundred Years'
Yes,
War, right?
yes,
And then and then we have that brief interlude, and then 20 years after that, we've got the Wars of the Roses
yeah,
that basically tears apart England. But on the
yeah,
continent itself, France, has just recovered from the Hundred Years' War, but then they decide to go on a military adventure in Italy, where for the next 20 to
yes.
30 years they're fighting the Spanish and the Habsburgs for influence in the Italian peninsula. And
Mm,
as as you've referred, this was brutal fighting.
yes.
We're talking about warfare that hasn't been seen on unprecedented level. And I recall a scene from the Borgias. You remember that Showtime series, the Borgias, with Jeremy
I'm
Irons?
aware of the Borgias. I know
Okay, so
I know the story of the family. Yes.
so there's a scene in the Borgias where the French are marching into on Lucca, the city of Lucca, and the messenger rides up and tells King Charles, my liege, they're willing to surrender, but they need to discuss terms. And the king says, "Oh well, we'll show them terms." And he produces these cannons, and they're firing like these huge these huge rounds into the city walls. And and in that brief scene, there's like this terror because the Italians have never seen cannon fire before.
Mm.
They're not used to the fighting that the French have been used to for those past hundreds of years. So and there's another scene too, where the army of the Papal States marches outside of Rome to try to block Charles from ransacking Rome, and you have all these Italian troops kind of massed out on the plain, right? And they're thinking, oh, they're just going to charge. It's kind of like with Braveheart, both armies charge the field and attack. No, the French are standing there and they pull out. They do what they did at Lucca. They pull out the cannons and they fire, and it's just a few. They fire just a few shots, but the entire army is decimated. Like everybody gets mowed down. So so imagine being among those ranks, having to see this new kind of warfare. It's the equivalent
Yes.
of what happened in World War One, where people thought they were fighting a conventional war.
And became
line
that war of
forma-
attrition. Yeah.
yeah, traditional line formations, cavalry, and everything. By the time you get to 1917, it's a completely different world.
And you see
Um,
tanks rolling across no man's land. Yeah.
Exactly. So to go
Yeah.
back to your point about Benedict, I mean, Benedict being the character that he is, I
Mm.
mean, you're talking, at the surface level, you're saying to yourself, oh, this is just a guy that likes to clown around. But when you understand the context and you kind of put
Yes.
yourself in that mentality, it's like this is a guy who's processing a lot of trauma, right? This is
Yes.
a man who
He's
this is a man who's
yes.
who has to find some way to retain his sanity because because especially if he's been fighting in Italy, he's probably had to deal with charging into pike formations. He's probably had to deal with arquebus fire. He's probably had to see his mates getting mowed down by
Yes.
all this new technology. I mean, I mean, if he if he doesn't do something, he's probably going to lock himself in a room and off himself, right?
Exactly. I mean, or he could have been fighting in the Spanish Peninsula against the Moors, which again was happening at the same time. Again, a completely different style of fighting again.
Right,
And
right.
you are absolutely right. And then, so you get Pedro, who treats everything like a military campaign, which kind of makes sense because he's used to right, that there, that there. He's playing a game of chess all the time. He's 3 moves ahead, and he treats it like that. And you got Claudio, who's come
Yeah.
through this fighting and survived. And no wonder he doesn't know how to deal with women. He's been spending his life trying to survive in these battles.
I mean, it's a
So it
universal
adds a
it's a
different
universal
layer.
lesson. Yeah, it's a
Mm.
universal thing that people still deal with. I mean, I've experienced it firsthand. I mean, when my father came to the U.S., and I came along, he pretty much he really didn't know how to raise kids. He knew how to guard prisoners, but he didn't know how to raise kids. So he was like, well,
Is it the same thing?
yeah, it's well, he's misbehaving. I'll just pull out my belt and whip him a little bit, and then he'll shut
Oh
up. So,
gosh. Oh,
so it's
dear.
that's a bleak picture into my childhood.
Just let them out. Let them out for half an hour of exercise time.
Exactly, but to go back to your point, I mean, those three are pretty much. I mean, if you think about it, they kind of represent like the 3 ways that people that former military people kind of process civilian life. One could
Mm.
either see life as a big joke, the other could permanently see themselves in the military and kind of like put themselves in discipline, and the other is just a wreck and just is like the only place I feel comfortable is when I'm on the battlefield with my boot on someone's neck, getting ready to plunge my spear into them.
I mean,
You know?
and then if you
I mean, that's tragic in itself.
No, it is. But then if you apply that context, now looking at the play, it really does change it. I mean, it's still hilariously funny, and some of the lines and the twists and tales are really funny. But if you add that layer of context to it, it suddenly becomes almost black humor, almost a dark comedy,
Exactly. Yeah.
instead of this kind of clownish buffoonery, which we all love. We all love Kenneth Branagh falling off the deck chair in his version. We
But
all
it kind of
love
misses the
kind of
mark, though. That's the thing.
It does
Like,
because they ride in, and when they ride in, there's this great scene at the beginning of Branagh's version where they ride over the hillset, and there's Keanu Reeves, and his locks are blowing in the air, and his shirt's just a little bit uncomfortably unbuttoned a bit too far. You know, that kind of
yeah, like
heroic.
Fabio.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And you got even Baraccio's looking quite noble as they're kind of striding, and Don Pedro's there. It's Denzel. He's looking so amazing, and There's not a mark on them. They're all smiles and they're all very heroic. And you
Yeah, he's
go,
never
hang
been in a
on,
war.
I don't, yeah, it just doesn't, because he's played it as they're the noble victors who've arrived, and it almost as if he hasn't quite understand how, I'm going to call it medieval for the want of a better word, how medieval or late medieval warfare works,
Hmm.
or the effect it could have. I mean, there's a reason that the life expectancy. I read a paper recently where it was only like 1890 when people started dying of old age, because
Right.
up to then it was cholera, war, famine, pestilence,
Right,
everything else.
and they were all products of war too. Because if you because I read Peter Wilson's book about the 30 Years War.
Mm,
I mean, it's amazing to think that it was a third of of the population of the Holy Roman Empire died, indirectly because of what happened. Because most of the deaths occurred because of disease and starvation and famine,
yes.
caused by these armies that were marching through. And keep in mind too, I mean, no part of the Holy Roman Empire was untouched. I mean,
Mm,
if it wasn't the Swedes causing devastations, it was the French. Um, as part of their policy to try to weaken the Habsburg Empire and effectively neuter the Holy Roman Empire.
mm.
Um,
I mean, even if you look at Henry V's march, the historical, how many of his troops died before he even got anywhere near Agincourt?
exactly.
And the historical records show that if he hadn't fought then and there at Agincourt, he wouldn't have survived. It was a kind of do or die moment. I mean, it's been dramatized, and we've got this lovely kind of this image of Henry V, the warrior king. But literally, it was his last chance. Otherwise, his army would have just either dysenteried away or run away. It was he was losing control, and it was that
Right.
amazing victory that just happened at the right time in the right place, and that changed everything. The march from to Agincourt was bleak, really bleak.
It's actually surprised that the English won at all, considering the fact that they were dwindling in numbers, whereas the French pretty much had the advantage. I mean, it all just came down
Mm,
to a muddy field at the end. You know.
mm. I mean, I've had the privilege of visiting the site, and it's a French-run museum, and it's very bizarre because when you go there, it has the obligatory kind of English commentary, and
Hmm.
we went there, and we watched this video about the background to Agincourt, and it was like 1415 Agincourt, and then it was a picture of Churchill, and then Margaret Thatcher, and I'm like, hang on, what is this? And it was talking about British imperialism,
It's an
and
ad for the Tories, so.
And I was like, what is going on? And then it was basically, if you read the between the lines, it was like, oh, the English cheated. And I was like, hang on. And there's a monument. Just there's lots of monuments around it. There was a tragic battle. It was a really on both sides. It was an awful battle. But there's
Right.
a statue, and it's dedicated, and it was purchased. I need to make sure I might be wrong, but this is how I remember it. It's purchased or paid for by the French police force, and it's a statue of this chap who was a provost officer in the
Hmm.
army, who officially, the first policeman, brutally slain in his prime by the wicked, cheating English. And there's this statue of this random provost officer. I'm like, this is very strange. And it comes down to, I've seen, there's lots of great you mentioned David Starkey in your early kind of our
Yeah.
chat beforehand. There's this lovely documentary, and it does come down to the fact that the tactics on the day, literally Henry was looking at his troops going, what do I do? I literally can't do anything. This is what I'm going to do. I'll do what I've got, and I'll see how that works. And it worked. He lost. He didn't have many mounted knights. He saw that there were 10,000 French mounted knights. There's no way you're going to go into battle against them. as as typical medieval warfare would be. You can't do that.
Right.
So you had to go with what you've got. I've got so many archers. Well, I've got them. I might as well use them.